Welcome back to Nightmare Theatre. Arthur Pembroke here. Today I'm going to be talking about 3 true stories involving school lockdowns. I want to thank everyone who submitted a story. If anyone has a true scary story they would like me to cover, feel free to email it or reach out on the various social media links. Let's begin with tonight's first story. I was in study hall, just staring out the window, kind of zoning out. It was one of those rainy days where everything feels weirdly quiet, and honestly, I was just counting the minutes until the final bell. Then, out of nowhere, the intercom crackled, and the principal's voice came on. She sounded tense, like she was barely holding it together. "Attention, students and staff! We are in a lockdown. This is not a drill. Please follow all lockdown procedures immediately." At first, I didn't really process it. I'd been through a bunch of drills before, and I guess my brain just didn't want to believe this was real. But then Mr. Carter, our study hall teacher, went pale and rushed to lock the door. I saw his hands shaking as he pulled down the blinds and turned off the lights. He didn't even look at us, just muttered, "Everybody get down against the wall and stay quiet." We all kind of looked at each other, not really understanding what was going on, but we shuffled over to the corner of the room and sat down. I was right next to my friend Rachel, and I could feel her hand grip my arm. She was squeezing so hard it hurt, but I didn't say anything. The silence was the worst part. All of us were just sitting there in the dark, trying not to even breathe too loud. Mr. Carter sat near us, his eyes glued to the door, like he was expecting it to burst open any second. I remember how I kept thinking about all the people I hadn't texted back that day, and how I hadn't told my mum I loved her when I left that morning. I know it sounds dramatic, but that's where my brain went. After a while, maybe 10 minutes, though it felt way longer, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, heavy footsteps, like someone was taking their time. They were getting closer, and I think all of us were praying they'd pass by. But they didn't. They stopped right outside our door. Rachel's breathing got faster, and I squeezed her hand back, hoping it would calm her down. I could feel my own heart pounding so hard I thought I'd be sick. The door handle jiggled once, then again, like someone was testing it. Mr. Carter held a finger to his lips, his eyes wide, and mouthed, "Stay quiet." The door handle stopped moving, but then we heard this scraping sound, like whoever was out there was dragging something metal along the doorframe. It was slow, like they wanted us to hear it. Rachel let out a tiny whimper, and I think Mr. Carter was about to say something to calm her down, but the scraping stopped and the footsteps started again. This time, they were moving away. I thought that was it. I thought we were safe. But then, my phone buzzed in my pocket and I almost jumped out of my skin. I'd forgotten to turn it off, so I pulled it out as slowly as I could, praying it wouldn't make any noise. The message was from another friend, Lucas, who was in a different classroom on the second floor. All it said was, "They're telling us to stay down, but the guy is inside the building. He's wearing a dark hoodie and carrying something, maybe a pipe. Stay safe." As soon as I read it, I showed Rachel and her eyes went wide. She mouthed, "Oh my God." I glanced over at Mr. Carter and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. About 5 minutes later, the sound of footsteps came back. This time, they sounded more frantic, like someone running. I heard doors slamming down the hall, and then, just outside, the heavy breathing of someone who'd been running. We all froze, hardly daring to breathe. Whoever was out there tried the handle again, jiggling it harder this time, and I could tell they were getting frustrated. Then, finally, we heard voices from further down the hallway. It was the police, shouting commands I couldn't fully make out, but they were getting closer. Whoever was outside our door hesitated, then bolted. We heard his footsteps racing away, followed by the sound of the police chasing after him. A few minutes later, there was a loud banging at our door, and Mr. Carter called out, "Who's there?" It was the police telling us it was safe to come out. We slowly got to our feet, legs stiff from sitting so long, and filed out into the hallway. There were cops everywhere, and a couple of kids were crying. I remember feeling dazed, like none of it was real. They let us go home early that day, but nobody really talked about what had happened until the next day. Apparently, the guy had somehow slipped in through a side door that hadn't latched properly, and he'd been wandering around the school, trying doors and looking for, well, I don't know what, and I don't want to know. For the next few weeks, I couldn't sit in class without glancing at the door every 5 seconds. Every little noise made me jump, and I'd catch myself tensing up every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. I think it was the not knowing that freaked me out the most. Knowing that we were just a locked door away from someone who might have wanted to hurt us, and that there was nothing we could have done if he'd gotten in. Story 2. It was my last class of the day when the lockdown alarm blared through the loudspeakers. It wasn't unusual to have drills, but something about this one felt different. The principal's voice played through the intercom. Her voice was shaky. Students and faculty, this is a lockdown. I repeat, this is a lockdown. Please follow all emergency procedures. Normally, everyone rolls their eyes and we shuffle into the corner trying to keep from laughing or pulling out our phones. But today, the silence felt thick. My history teacher, Mr. Klein, usually treated lockdowns like a minor inconvenience, but today his face looked scared. He rushed to the door, flicking off the lights and locking it before pulling the blinds closed with trembling hands. "Everyone get down," he said quietly. "Move away from the windows. Don't talk." We crouched under our desks, nobody saying a word. My heart pounded in my ears as I pulled out my phone, wanting to text my mum, but Mr. Klein held up his hand, shaking his head. No phones. Reluctantly, I shoved it back in my pocket, feeling a strange, twisting fear settle in my chest. Minutes passed. It was so quiet that I could hear someone breathing hard across the room. Outside, faint noises echoed down the hall. At first I thought they were footsteps, heavy and slow, but I couldn't be sure. I held my breath, straining to listen. Every few moments there would be a shuffle, a click, or a faint cough somewhere in the distance. Then a thud, loud, unmistakable, echoed from a few classrooms down. A girl next to me grabbed my arm, her face frozen in terror. "Do you think it's a shooter?" she whispered. I didn't answer. My throat felt tight, and I couldn't bring myself to say anything. After a long stretch of silence, I thought maybe it was over. I started to relax, feeling silly for letting my mind run wild. But then there was another bang, closer this time. It was followed by voices, muffled but frantic, echoing down the hallway. Doors opening, slamming, people moving in a controlled panic. The faint sound of police radios crackled from somewhere just outside. Then we heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, a low, shaky, pleading voice, somewhere just outside our door. It was a man's voice, but it was quiet. So quiet I could hardly make out what he was saying. Mr. Klein's eyes widened, and he quickly moved his finger to his lips, signaling us to stay quiet. The doorknob rattled, and I froze. Someone outside was jiggling the handle, trying to get in. Mr. Klein stood near the door, looking out through the small glass window, and he mouthed to us, "Stay calm." We all held our breath as the doorknob stopped rattling, but then the sound of faint footsteps moving away filled the silence. I could see Mr. Klein's face in the dim light, his eyes darting left and right as he tried to gauge what was going on outside. After what felt like an eternity, we heard heavy, hurried footsteps approach the door. Someone banged on it hard, and I flinched, trying not to make a sound. Mr. Klein walked to the door and carefully looked out the small window, his shoulders sagging in relief. He looked back at us, a faint smile on his lips. "It's the police," he whispered. "Just stay put." 2 police officers opened the door a crack, telling Mr. Klein it was safe to come out. They were quiet, calm, but something about their faces was unsettling. They looked almost as shaken as we were. We all filed out into the hallway, staying close to each other. Down the hall, I saw a few other officers talking to some teachers. Their faces were grim, like they'd seen something that disturbed them. When we were finally outside, we noticed other groups of students, some crying, others staring at the ground in shock. I overheard a teacher talking to a police officer and caught fragments of their conversation. Someone had been found in the building, an intruder, a man who wasn't supposed to be there. No one knew how he'd gotten in, but they said he'd been hiding somewhere inside the school for several days. Later, rumors started circulating. Some people said the intruder was someone with mental health issues who had wandered in from off the street. Others said he had a knife and was planning something far worse, but had panicked when the lockdown started. Teachers never really told us what happened, and the school was vague, saying only that there had been a security incident. For weeks, the whole school felt different. They installed new locks, hired an extra security guard, and the principal's voice seemed shakier whenever she made announcements. Every so often we get another lockdown drill, and even though we tried to laugh it off, I could feel it in the air, that sense that something had changed. And whenever I think back on that day, I still hear the rattling of the doorknob, that faint, pleading voice on the other side, and the feeling that someone had been there with us, watching and waiting. And the final story for tonight. I was down in the basement, finishing up some paperwork in my tiny, cluttered office, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from the school's alert system. Lockdown in effect, all staff follow protocol immediately. At first I thought it was a drill. They didn't usually give me a heads up for these things, but it's a school. Lockdowns happen, and I knew the drill. I glanced around my office, listening to the hum of the boiler and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. And then I silenced my phone, leaning back in my chair to wait it out. I figured I'd just hunker down here until they gave the all clear. Then, not even 2 minutes later, I heard footsteps echoing down the basement corridor. They were heavy, uneven and quick, like someone in a hurry but trying to stay quiet. My gut twisted a little. I knew the school layout well, and there weren't many places down here that someone could be heading to. My office was pretty much the end of the line. I was just about to poke my head out the door when a man burst in. He was out of breath, his face flushed, and his eyes were darting around the room like he was looking for something. He was wearing a dark jacket and had a wild, almost frantic look in his eyes. "Is there a way out down here?" he asked, voice shaky but low, almost a whisper. For a second I thought he might just be a teacher who'd gotten lost in the lockdown confusion. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my cool, and said, there's a door that leads out to the back parking lot." I pointed vaguely in its direction, trying to seem calm. The last thing I wanted to do was set him off if he was panicking. As I was talking, my phone buzzed again in my pocket. Out of reflex, I glanced down at it, and my stomach dropped. It was a text from Mark, one of the other janitors. The intruder ran downstairs, dark jacket, kind of scruffy looking. "If you see him, don't engage. Cops are on their way." My eyes flicked back up to the guy standing in my office, and he looked exactly like Mark had described. Dark jacket, scruffy face, and these wide bloodshot eyes. I felt my pulse quicken, my hands feeling clammy as I tried not to show any sign that I knew exactly who he was. "All right," I said, keeping my voice steady. "If you go out this door and head straight down the hall, you'll see a stairwell to your left. Take that up, and you'll be at the exit." The man nodded, glancing over his shoulder, but he didn't move. His eyes narrowed, and I realized with a sick feeling in my gut that he'd noticed my phone. He stared at it, then back at me, suspicion dawning on his face. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the phone in my hand. His voice had changed, lower, harder. I swallowed, trying to keep my cool. "Just an alert about the lockdown," I said, shrugging casually. They tell us to stay put and keep things locked down, you know? He didn't look convinced. He took a step closer, his eyes darting to the door like he was weighing his options. "You sure that's all it is?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. His tone was icy, a complete shift from the nervous, frantic guy who had burst in here seconds ago. I forced a nod, not daring to look away from him. "Yeah, just a standard alert." But his eyes narrowed even further, and I could see his hands starting to clench. My heart was pounding so loudly that I thought he might hear it. I was running through my options, wondering if I could make it to the door before he got to me, when suddenly there was a loud, commanding voice from down the hallway. "Police! Hands where we can see them!" The man froze, and for a split second he looked like he might try to bolt. But then 3 officers appeared in the doorway, guns drawn and aimed straight at him. He put his hands up slowly, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to defeat, as the officers closed in, cuffing his hands behind his back. One of the officers glanced at me as they were leading the man away. "You all right?" he asked, and I nodded, trying to keep my hands from shaking. "Yeah," I managed to say, voice steadying as the adrenaline began to wear off. "Yeah, I'm fine." After they took him out, I just sat there for a minute, staring at the door, trying to process everything. The way he'd looked at me, that realization in his eyes when he knew I'd recognized him, it left me cold. I'd been seconds away from who knows what happening if the police hadn't shown up. By the time they gave the all clear, the halls were buzzing with whispers about the intruder in the building. I heard he was recently out on parole and was trying to kidnap his son from the building. That's all for tonight. Thank you again for joining me here at Nightmare Theatre. I'll see you all again tomorrow night.